Missing Innocence. Mom sent son to neighbor's house. He never returned. 14 years later. Neighbor's deathbed confession changed everything. A small pair of blue sneakers with yellow lightning bolts. That is all Margaret Chen had left of her son Daniel after she sent him next door to borrow sugar from their trusted neighbor. Robert Kendall, on July 12, 2009, the 80-year-old vanished without a trace that summer afternoon in Portland, Oregon. 14 years later, a dying man's deathbed confession would reveal the shocking truth about this child disappearance. A truth so devastating it would change everything this family believed about the day their son never returned. This is the haunting story of Daniel Chen, a missing children case that proves monsters don't always look like monsters. Daniel Chen was 8 years old in the summer of 2009, a kid who collected Pokemon cards and played Little League Baseball in the Beaverton neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. His parents, Margaret and David Chen, had moved to this quiet cul-de-sac 3 years earlier, believing it was the perfect place to raise their 2 children. Danny was my sunshine. Margaret remembered he'd wake up every morning singing, making up songs about Pokemon and baseball. His sister Emily said he was annoying, but she loved him so much. Daniel's bedroom told the story of a normal, happy childhood, Pokemon posters covering the walls, baseball trophies on shelves, a jar of quarters he was saving for more trading cards. This wasn't a troubled kid from a broken home. This was every parent's child, living in every parent's neighborhood, about to become every parent's nightmare. The family's next-door neighbor was Robert Kendall, a 52-year-old retired postal worker who seemed like the perfect neighbor. He'd helped the Chens move in, lent tools without hesitation, even gave Daniel Pokemon cards for his birthday. Kendall's wife, Patricia, traveled frequently for her nursing job, so he often spent weekends alone, tending his garden and waving to neighbors. Trust, that's what made this missing child case so particularly haunting. The Chens trusted Robert Kendall completely. July 12, 2009. A Sunday afternoon, Margaret Chen was baking chocolate chip cookies for the church fundraiser that evening when she realized she'd run out of sugar around 2:30 p.m. Daniel was playing video games in the living room, still in his pajama pants and that blue t-shirt with yellow lightning bolts matching his blue sneakers. "Sweetheart," Margaret called out, "can you run next door and ask Mr. Kendall if we can borrow a cup of sugar? I'll give you a warm cookie when you get back." Through the kitchen window, Margaret watched her son cross their lawn. She watched him knock on Kendall's front door. She watched the door open. She watched Daniel disappear inside the house. That was 2:35 p.m. At 3:15 p.m., Margaret called Daniel's cell phone. No answer. At 3:45 p.m., she walked next door and knocked on Kendall's door. No answer! His car sat in the driveway, but the house was completely silent. By 4 p.m., panic set in. She called her husband David, who raced home from his downtown office. They knocked harder, rang the doorbell repeatedly, called Daniel's phone over and over. The calls went straight to voicemail. At 4:47 p.m., David Chen made the call that would change their lives forever. 911. "My son went to our neighbor's house over 2 hours ago and he never returned. No one's answering the door. Please, we need help now." Portland police arrived at 5:03 p.m. Officers Matt Rodriguez and Jennifer Walsh approached Robert Kendall's house with growing concern. They knocked with authority. They announced themselves. Nothing. At 5:47 p.m., with Margaret's tearful permission to check her property, officers made the decision to force entry into Kendall's home. They kicked in the front door, weapons drawn, clearing room after room. The house was neat, ordinary, chilling in its normalness. Coffee cups in the sink. Mail sorted on the counter. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table. But no Robert Kendall. No Daniel Chen. And most disturbing, Kendall's car in the driveway had a cold engine. He hadn't driven anywhere. Detective Sarah Morrison, who would lead this child missing case for the next 14 years, arrived at 6:23 p.m. She walked through Kendall's house, her trained eyes searching for anything that could explain where an 80-year-old boy and a 52-year-old man had vanished to. In the basement, she found something that made her blood run cold: a small puddle of what appeared to be cleaning solution near the washing machine, and the faint smell of bleach that should be there in a bachelorette's laundry room on a Sunday afternoon. At 7 p.m., an Amber Alert blasted across Oregon and Washington. Daniel Chen, 8, Asian male, Fort Wu, 60 lb, black hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing blue t-shirt with yellow lightning bolts, gray pajama pants, blue sneakers. Possibly with Robert Kendall, 52, white male, 5 feet 10, 180 pounds, gray hair. Consider this a child abduction case. Call 911 immediately if seen. By nightfall, hundreds of volunteers had gathered at Beaverton High School, organizing search parties to comb through nearby parks, woods, and streets. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees throughout the neighborhood. News vans lined the street, and Margaret Chun sat in her living room, clutching one of Daniel's Pokemon cards, whispering, "Please, baby, please come home." Before I reveal what investigators discovered next, let me ask you, if your child disappeared into a trusted neighbor's house and both of them vanished without a trace, what would you think happened? Comment below, because this case is about to take a turn that no one saw coming. Within 12 hours of Daniel's disappearance, Robert Kendall had become the subject of one of the largest manhunts in Pacific Northwest history. But the man had seemingly disappeared without a trace, taking with him the answers to a terrified family's questions. Detective Morrison pulled Kendall's complete background by 3 a.m. on July 13th. On paper, he was spotless. No criminal record, no history of violence, no registered complaints. He'd worked for the United States Postal Service for 27 years before retiring in 2007. He paid his taxes. He volunteered at the local library. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen. But as investigators dug deeper into this unsolved case, disturbing patterns emerged. Kendall's computer history, recovered by FBI digital forensics teams, showed searches that made the investigation team's stomachs turn. How long before missing child case goes cold? Police search radius missing persons, and most chilling, unresolved mystery techniques. His wife, Patricia, interviewed in Seattle where she'd been attending a nursing conference, was devastated and confused. "Robert loved kids," she sobbed to detectives. "He talked about us having children, but we couldn't. He was so good with the neighborhood kids. I don't understand. I don't understand any of this." Phone records showed Kendall's cell phone had been turned off at 2:42 p.m. On July 12th, just 7 minutes after Daniel entered his house, his bank accounts showed no activity after July 11th. No credit card purchases, no ATM withdrawals. It was as if Robert Kendall had planned to vanish. For the first 2 weeks, Portland became a city consumed by one mission: find Daniel Chen. This child disappearance case dominated every news cycle. Volunteers searched forests, parks, rivers, abandoned buildings. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the surrounding areas. Divers searched the Willamette River and every body of water within a 50-mile radius. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team took over the command center at Beaverton Police Headquarters. Agent Marcos Webb, a veteran of dozens of kidnapped children cases, knew the statistics were grim. The first 48 hours are critical in any abducted child case, he told the media on day 3. "We're past that window, but we're not giving up. Someone knows something." Tips flooded in, thousands of them. A man matching Kendall's description was spotted in Seattle, in San Francisco, in Vancouver, British Columbia, in Phoenix. Every single lead was investigated. Every single one was a dead end. On July 19th, 1 week after the disappearance, a massive search party of over 2,000 volunteers combed through Forest Park, Portland's massive urban wilderness. They found nothing. On July 26th, cadaver dogs were brought in to search Kendall's property again. They alerted in 3 locations: the basement near the washing machine, a spot in the garage, and an area in the backyard near the fence line. Forensic teams excavated those areas, searching for any evidence of this missing child case. They found traces of blood in the basement, but not enough for DNA testing with 2009 technology. They found disturbed soil in the backyard, but no remains. The garage yielded nothing concrete. Margaret Chun watched from her window as investigators dug up her neighbor's yard. "I kept thinking they'd find him," she later testified. "Part of me hoped they would, just so I'd know. Then not knowing was killing me." August 2009 brought the first false lead that would devastate the Chun family. A caller to the tip line reported seeing a boy matching Daniel's description at a rest stop in Northern California with an older white male. Police descended on the location. It wasn't Daniel. In September, a psychic medium contacted the family, claiming she could communicate with Daniel and that he was alive, being held in a blue house near water. Margaret, desperate for any hope, begged detectives to investigate. They did. They found nothing. The psychic was exposed as a fraud who targeted families of missing persons. October brought another crushing blow. Kendall's abandoned car was found in a long-term parking lot at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, parked there since July 13th. This discovery suggested Kendall had fled the country, possibly taking Daniel with him. International alerts were issued. Interpol was notified. Border Patrol agents received bulletins, but airport security footage showed something different. Robert Kendall had arrived at the airport alone on the morning of July 13. He'd purchased a ticket to Toronto using cash. He'd gone through security, and then he'd walked out of the airport through a different exit, never boarding the flight. The trail went cold again. He wanted us to think he'd left the country, Detective Morrison realized. This was misdirection, which meant he was still close. But where? By December 2009, the case had gone cold. The FBI reduced their presence. Media coverage dwindled. The community's yellow ribbons faded in the rain, and the Chung family faced their first Christmas without Daniel. His presence wrapped in waiting under the tree, a haunting reminder of the child who never returned. Stay with me, because what happens next in this shocking revelation will show you just how deep Kendall's deception went. The first year after Daniel's disappearance nearly destroyed the Chun family. David Chun threw himself into the investigation, spending every waking hour following leads, creating spreadsheets, mapping potential locations. He lost his job when he stopped showing up to work. Margaret quit nursing and dedicated her life to missing children advocacy, creating the Daniel's Light Foundation to help other families navigate the nightmare of child disappearance. She appeared on news programs, distributed flyers, never stopped searching, but their marriage couldn't survive the weight of their grief and guilt. "We blamed each other," David admitted years later. "I blamed Margaret for sending him next door. She blamed me for not being home. We blamed ourselves." The guilt was suffocating. Emily Chun, Daniel's older sister, was 11 years old when her brother vanished. She became withdrawn, struggled in school, developed severe anxiety. "I felt invisible," she later wrote in her memoir. "My brother was missing, but I was disappearing too." On the first anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, July 12, 2010, over 500 community members gathered at the Beaverton Community Center for a vigil. They released blue and yellow balloons, Daniel's favorite colors. Margaret Chun spoke through tears. "Daniel, if you can hear me, we're never going to stop looking. Never. You're coming home to us. I promise you, baby, you're coming home." But as year 2 became year 3, as the case remained unsolved, as Robert Kendall remained a ghost, the hard truth settled over everyone involved. They might never know what happened to Daniel Chun. Detective Morrison kept the case file open on her desk, refusing to move it to cold case storage. "I made a promise to that family," she said. "I don't break promises." But then in March 2013, nearly 4 years after Daniel's disappearance, a jogger in rural Washington State, over 200 miles from Portland, made a discovery in an abandoned cabin that would crack this missing children case wide open. What investigators found would prove that Robert Kendall had been closer than anyone imagined all along, and the truth about where he'd been hiding and what he'd been doing would shock even the most experienced investigators on this cold case. March 17, 2013. A woman named Jessica Torres was training for a marathon on rural logging roads near Packwood, Washington, about 220 miles north of Portland. She decided to explore a side trail she'd never noticed before and stumbled upon an old hunting cabin, nearly hidden by overgrown vegetation. The cabin looked abandoned, but something made her approach. Call it instinct. Call it fate. But Jessica noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small blue sneaker, weathered and faded, sitting on the cabin's rotting port. It had yellow lightning bolts on the side. She called 911 immediately. Within hours, Lewis County Sheriff's deputies, FBI agents, and Detective Morrison were at the scene. The cabin belonged to a man named Robert Jameson, but property records showed it had been sold in 2008 to a Harold Patterson. Investigators ran the name. Harold Patterson didn't exist. It was a false identity, but the handwriting on the property transfer documents, it matched Robert Kendall's. The cabin became a crime scene unlike anything Detective Morrison had encountered in her 20-year career. Inside, they found evidence that someone had been living there recently. There were supplies, canned goods, bottled water, a camping stove. There was a sleeping bag. There were books, and most chillingly, there was a child's backpack containing notebooks filled with Pokemon drawings in the name Daniel written over and over in a child's handwriting. But there was no Daniel Chen, no Robert Kendall, just evidence of their presence and another vanishing act. Forensic teams processed the scene. For 3 days, they found Daniel's DNA throughout the cabin, on the sleeping bag, on clothing, on the notebooks. They found adult male DNA that matched Robert Kendall's genetic profile built from items in his home. The evidence was irrefutable. Daniel had been held in this cabin. But there was something else investigators found that changed the entire trajectory of this missing child case. A grave. 50 yards behind the cabin, cadaver dogs alerted to a shallow grave site. Investigators carefully excavated, expecting to find Daniel's remains. Instead, they found the body of Robert Kendall. Robert Kendall had been dead for approximately 3 years, according to the medical examiner. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. He'd been struck multiple times with what appeared to be a heavy object, possibly a rock found near the gravesite. This changed everything. Detective Morrison explained at a press conference that sent shockwaves through the true crime community. We'd been hunting for a kidnapper and his victim. Now we were looking at a homicide victim and a missing witness, or a missing suspect. We didn't know anymore. The implications were staggering. If Kendall had been dead since around 2010, what had happened to Daniel? Had he killed his abductor in self-defense and run? Was he alive somewhere? Traumatized? Unable to come forward? Had something else happened in that cabin that no one could yet explain? The FBI expanded their search. They brought in additional cadaver dogs to search the entire area around the cabin. They found no additional graves. They searched for any evidence of where Daniel might have gone after Kendall's death. They found nothing. Margaret Chun received the news in her living room. Detective Morrison sitting across from her. "Is my son alive?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Chun, I honestly don't know," Morrison replied, "but finding Kendall dead means there's a possibility. There's hope." The discovery of Kendall's body in the cabin reignited national attention on this unsolved case. Every major news network covered the story. Theories flooded social media. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to the mysterious disappearances and the shocking truth that Kendall was dead, not hiding. Investigators built a timeline. Kendall had abducted Daniel, taken him to this remote cabin using a second vehicle he'd hidden in a storage unit, later discovered, held him there for approximately 1 year before being killed. But by whom? And where was Daniel now, if he was alive? The FBI analyzed the notebooks found in the cabin. Child psychologists examined the drawings and writings. They painted a picture of a child in captivity, drawing pictures of Pokemon and home, writing his name repeatedly as if reminding himself of his identity. The later entries showed more sophisticated drawings, Daniel aging, growing, coping with his nightmare. One notebook entry, dated approximately 2 months before Kendall's estimated death, haunted investigators. I want to go home, but he says I can't. He says Mom doesn't want me anymore. I know that's not true. I know she's looking, going to get out. I have a plan. A plan. Did Daniel Chen, held captive for nearly a year, find a way to fight back? Did this child, now 9 years old, kill his abductor in self-defense and escape? If so, why hadn't he come forward? Why hadn't he gone home? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. This child abduction case had become something far more complex. A missing persons investigation where the victim might be alive, might be a killer, might be hiding, or might be another victim buried somewhere yet undiscovered. And then, years of silence would follow. Daniel Chen's trail went cold again. The cabin yielded no more secrets. The investigation, despite renewed vigor, hit wall after wall. But stay with me, because 11 years later, a dying man would finally break that silence with a deathbed confession that would change everything. Between 2013 and 2023, the Chen family lived in a strange limbo. Knowing their son had survived at least a year of captivity, knowing his abductor was dead, but not knowing if Daniel himself was alive or dead, victim or survivor, lost or hiding. Margaret Chen never gave up hope. Finding that cabin, knowing he lived past that first day, it changed everything for me. She told supporters at a Daniel's Light Foundation fundraiser in 2015, "My son survived. He was strong. He had a plan." I believe Daniel is still fighting to come home. She aged a decade in those years. Her hair went gray, lines deepened around her eyes, but she never stopped advocating for missing children. Never stopped keeping Daniel's case in the public eye. Never stopped believing. David Chen took a different path. After the divorce was finalized in 2014, he moved to Seattle and became a private investigator specializing in cold cases. "I couldn't save my son," he admitted in a 2018 interview. "But maybe I can save someone else's child. Maybe I can give another family the closure we've never had." Emily Chen graduated high school, then college, always with an empty space beside her where her brother should have stood. She became a therapist specializing in trauma and family tragedy. "Daniel's disappearance defined my entire life," she wrote in her 2020 memoir, The Sister Left Behind, "but I refused to let it destroy me. I think Danny would want me to live." Every July 12th, the anniversary vigils continued. Every year, fewer people attended. The case faded from national consciousness, becoming just another unsolved mystery in a country full of them. Local news would run, "Where is Daniel Chen?" Stories on slow news days, but the public's attention drifted elsewhere. Detective Morrison retired in 2019 but kept Daniel's case file. "I take it out sometimes," she admitted. "I reread everything, hoping something will click. This case haunted my entire career. I can't let it go." By 2023, Daniel Chen's case was 14 years old. Most of the investigators who'd worked it had retired. The FBI had officially classified it as cold. The cabin in Washington had been demolished. Evidence sat in storage, reviewed occasionally but yielding nothing new. The community where Daniel had disappeared had changed. New families moved into the Beaverton neighborhood. The Chen's old house sold in 2016. Kendall's house had been torn down and rebuilt as a modern duplex. The physical reminders of that July day were gone. But Margaret Chen, now 58 years old, kept her son's bedroom exactly as he'd left it in her new apartment. The Pokemon cards, the Little League trophies, the jar of quarters, never spent. "I'm not preserving a shrine," she explained to a documentary filmmaker in 2022. "I'm keeping his room ready. When Daniel comes home, I want him to know nothing changed. I want him to know we never stopped waiting." Psychologists worried about her mental health. Was she in denial? Was she unable to accept that her son was likely dead? Or was a mother's instinct telling her something that evidence couldn't prove? "Everyone thinks I'm crazy," Margaret told her therapist. "Maybe I am, but I'm his mother. I'd know if he was dead. I'd feel it. And I don't. I feel him out there, somewhere, alive. This child missing case had ripple effects that extended far beyond one family. The Daniels Light Foundation helped hundreds of families navigate missing children cases. They funded searches, provided support groups, lobbied for better Amber Alert systems. Portland implemented new safety protocols in schools. Neighborhoods organized watch programs. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter, remembered that monsters could look like friendly neighbors. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the children who grew up in Daniel's shadow. His classmates, now in their 20s, carried his memory. "We all knew Daniel could be any of us," said Marcus Williams, who'd played Little League with Daniel. "It made us realize that safety is an illusion. Innocence is fragile." The true crime community remained fascinated by this unsolved case. Podcasts theorized. Reddit threads debated. Was Daniel dead? Buried somewhere unfound? Was he alive with amnesia? Had he been trafficked? Had he escaped and built a new life? Too traumatized to return. Every theory had holes. The truth remained frustratingly elusive. And then, in August 2023, a call came into Portland police that would finally, after 14 years, provide answers. A man named Thomas Brennan was dying of cancer in a hospice facility in Eugene, Oregon. He'd requested to speak with police about the Daniel Chen case. He claimed he knew what happened. He claimed he'd been there. What this dying man would reveal from his hospital bed would shock investigators, devastate the Chen family, and finally expose the shocking truth about the neighbor's deathbed confession that changed everything. Because Thomas Brennan wasn't a random witness. He was Robert Kendall's brother-in-law, and he'd been keeping a secret for 14 years. A secret that would rewrite everything everyone thought they knew about this haunting story. August 14th, 2023. Detective James Park, who'd inherited the Daniel Chen case when Morrison retired, sat in a hospice room in Eugene, Oregon, across from a skeletal man who could barely breathe without oxygen assistance. Thomas Brennan, 61, dying of stage 4 pancreatic cancer, had maybe weeks left to live, and he wanted to unburden his conscience. "I need to tell you about Daniel Chen," Thomas whispered, his voice rattling. "I need to tell you everything before I meet my maker. I can't die with this secret." What followed was a confession that answered 14 years of questions and revealed a truth more complex than anyone had imagined. Thomas Brennan was married to Robert Kendall's sister, Linda. He'd known Robert his entire adult life, and he'd known Robert had a dark secret, a sexual attraction to children that Robert had fought his entire life. Attending therapy, taking medication, trying desperately to control urges he'd never acted on, until Daniel Chen knocked on his door that July afternoon. "Robert called me that night," Thomas confessed, tears streaming down his sunken cheeks. He was panicking. He said he'd done something terrible. He said he'd taken the neighbor boy, that he'd driven him to the old hunting cabin, that he couldn't control himself anymore. He begged me to help him figure out what to do. Thomas had driven to the cabin the next day. He found Robert there with Daniel, who was terrified but physically unharmed. Robert was crying, saying he didn't know what happened to him, that he'd never wanted to hurt anyone. He kept saying he couldn't let Daniel go because he couldn't keep him because it was wrong. He was trapped in his own horrible choice. For the next year, Thomas Brennan became an accomplice in a kidnapped child's captivity. He brought supplies to the cabin. He helped Robert manage the situation. He convinced himself he was preventing something worse from happening. "I told myself I was protecting Daniel by making sure Robert didn't hurt him." Thomas said, "I brought him food, books, toys. I made sure he wasn't physically abused. But I was a monster too. I kept the child from his family for a year." But Thomas's confession revealed something investigators hadn't known. Daniel Chen hadn't killed Robert Kendall. Thomas had. In July 2010, 13 months after the abduction, Thomas had driven to the cabin and found Robert sexually assaulting Daniel. "Something in me broke," Thomas explained. "I'd convinced myself Robert was just scared, that he wouldn't actually hurt the boy. But seeing it, I grabbed a rock and I hit him. I hit him until he stopped moving. Thomas had buried Robert behind the cabin, cleaned up the scene, and then faced an impossible decision: what to do with Daniel. The boy was traumatized, barely speaking. I thought about calling police, but I'd be arrested. I thought about dropping him at a hospital, but he knew my face. So I, double quotes. Thomas's voice broke completely. I drove him to my brother's house. Thomas Brennan's brother, Martin Brennan, Lived, in rural Montana, running a small farm far from any major city. Martin had problems with alcohol and debt, and Thomas made him an offer. $50,000 cash to take Daniel in, no questions asked, and raise him as his own nephew from a bad family situation. Martin needed the money. He agreed. I told him Daniel's name was now Andrew, that he was never to ask questions, that he was never to let the boy contact anyone from his past. Martin didn't watch the news. He lived off the grid. He didn't know about the missing child case. Detective Park sat in stunned silence as Thomas continued. I gave Martin cash periodically over the years to take care of Daniel. I told myself I'd save the boy's life, that he was better off on a farm in Montana than dead. But I stole his identity. I stole his family. I'm a monster, just like Robert. Thomas provided Martin Brennan's address. He provided bank records showing the payments. He provided photos he'd secretly taken over the years, checking to make sure Daniel was okay. Photos showing a boy aging from 9 to 22, growing up on a Montana farm, alive but living a lie. Is he okay? Thomas asked. His breathing labored. Did I at least keep him alive? Detective Park didn't answer immediately. He was already on the phone, coordinating with Montana State Police, FBI, and trying to process that Daniel Chen, the missing child whose case had haunted an entire city for 14 years, was alive, had been alive all this time, living under a false name, just 800 miles away. August 16th, 2023. Montana State Police and FBI agents approached a small farm outside Missoula. They found Martin Brennan, who confirmed everything his brother had confessed, and they found a young man named Andrew who lived his entire adolescence and early adulthood believing his childhood before age 9 was too traumatic to remember. Daniel Chen, now 22 years old, 6 feet tall, with his mother's eyes and his father's smile, learned his true identity that afternoon. Psychologists and trauma specialists were present as investigators gently revealed the truth. His name was Daniel. He'd been kidnapped at 8 years old, and his family had never stopped looking for him. The young man broke down. Fragments of memory began surfacing: a mother's voice, a sister's laugh, Pokemon cards, a blue t-shirt with lightning bolts. I dreamed about them, he whispered. I thought they were just dreams. Margaret Chun received the call at 4:47 p.m. Pacific time. Exactly 14 years after, she decalled 911 to report her son missing. Mrs. Chun, this is Detective Park. I need you to sit down. We found Daniel. He's alive. The reunion happened 2 days later at Portland Police Headquarters, with psychologists Presena helped both mother and son process the overwhelming emotion. Margaret saw her son no longer a little boy but a grown man and collapsed. Daniel caught her, and in that moment, some piece of both of them began to heal. You're so big, Margaret sobbed, clutching his face. My baby, you're so big. Mom, Daniel whispered, the word foreign in his mouth but feeling like home. You never stopped looking. Never, she promised. Not for a single second. Thomas Brennan died 3 days after his confession, never learning that his deathbed revelation had reunited a family. Martin Brennan was arrested and charged with kidnapping and conspiracy. Though prosecutors acknowledged she provided Daniel a stable, if false, life, he pleaded guilty and received a reduced sentence of 5 years. The Chun family faced a complicated path forward. Daniel had been robbed of his childhood, his identity, his family. He had PTSD, memory gaps, anger at the years stolen. but he was alive, and that was a miracle no one had dared hope for. Emily Chun met her brother for the second time in her life, the first time as adults. "You were my hero when we were kids," she told him. "You're still my hero." David Chun flew in from Seattle, and father and son met in Margaret's living room, both crying, both trying to bridge 14 years of absence with a single embrace. The media frenzy was intense, but the family handled it carefully, controlling the narrative of Daniel's survival. "This isn't a feel-good story where everything's fixed," Margaret told reporters. "This is a tragedy with a better ending than most. We have our son back, but he lost 14 years. We all did." Today, Daniel Chun is in intensive therapy, working to process his trauma and reclaim his identity. He's returned to school, pursuing a degree in psychology. He wants to help other victims of child abduction cases. He wants to turn his pain into purpose. The Daniel's Light Foundation continues its work. Now, with Daniel himself as a board member, "I'm proof that missing children can come home," he said in his first public statement. "I'm proof you should never stop looking, never stop hoping." Margaret Chun finally changed Daniel's bedroom, not erasing it, but updating it. She gave him his Pokemon cards. He cried, holding them. This haunting story of child disappearance ends not with perfect healing, but with hard-won survival. Daniel Chun never returned to that July day in 2009. But 22-year-old Daniel Chun finally came home in 2023. If this shocking revelation moved you, hit that subscribe button for more missing children cases and true crime stories. Comment below with your thoughts on this case. How do you move forward after losing 14 years? Share this video to spread awareness about missing persons and the importance of never giving up hope. Remember, every missing child is someone's Daniel. Every family deserves answers. Every victim deserves to be found. This has been Missing Innocence. Thank you for bearing witness to Daniel's story.